Richard Chen had spent 30 years of his life inside fluorescent-lit offices, calculating numbers that mattered intensely to other people and very little to him. At 50 years old, he could look at a spreadsheet and spot an error in seconds, could predict quarterly trends with unsettling accuracy, and could explain tax code in language that even artists and musicians understood. What he could not do was remember the last time he had felt genuinely excited about anything. The realization hit him on a Tuesday morning in March, while he was reviewing expense reports for a client who owned a chain of moderately successful dental offices. The numbers were fine, everything balanced perfectly, and Richard felt absolutely nothing as he typed up his summary. He saved the file, closed his laptop, and sat staring at the blank screen for nearly 10 minutes before his assistant knocked on the door to remind him about his 11 o'clock meeting. That evening, he drove home to the house he'd bought 15 years earlier in a suburb of San Diego that was nice enough but not remarkable, parked in the garage next to his wife Susan's sedan, and found her in the kitchen preparing chicken and vegetables in the efficient way she'd been doing for their entire marriage. They'd raised 2 children in this house and both were now away at college, one studying engineering in Boston and the other pre-law at Berkeley, and the empty nest had revealed something Richard hadn't noticed, while the chaos of parenthood filled the spaces between them. He and Susan had very little to say to each other anymore. They ate dinner with the television on, some crime procedural that Susan followed but Richard couldn't keep straight, and afterward he loaded the dishwasher while she went upstairs to video call their daughter. Richard stood in the kitchen listening to the muffled sound of Susan's laughter floating down from the bedroom, and felt a loneliness so profound it actually made his chest ache. The next morning he took a different route to work, one that went along the coast highway instead of the inland freeway. Traffic was worse but he didn't care. He needed to see the ocean, needed to look at something that wasn't beige walls and computer screens. The Pacific stretched out gray and restless under an overcast sky, and Richard found himself slowing down to watch the waves roll in, one after another in their endless rhythm. A group of surfers sat bobbing beyond the break, dark shapes against the silvery water, waiting for something Richard couldn't see. As he watched, one of them turned and began paddling hard, and then suddenly the surfer was up and riding, carving across the face of a wave in a motion that looked simultaneously effortless and impossible. Richard felt something shift inside him, a spark of interest he couldn't remember experiencing in years. He arrived at work 20 minutes late, which never happened, and his assistant gave him a concerned look that he pretended not to notice. He made it through his morning meetings on autopilot, his mind returning again and again to that image of the surfer rising up out of the water, balanced impossibly on a board, moving with the kind of grace Richard had never possessed even as a young man. At lunch, he did something he would not have believed himself capable of doing. Instead of eating his usual turkey sandwich at his desk while reviewing files, he got in his car and drove back to the beach. He parked in a public lot and walked down to the sand, still wearing his dress shoes and slacks, and stood watching the surfers for nearly an hour. They ranged in age from teenagers to people who looked older than Richard, and their skill levels varied wildly. Some carved elegant lines across the waves while others struggled just to stand up, tumbling into the white water with what looked like good humor. Richard noticed that the ones who fell got back on their boards and paddled out again without hesitation, as if falling was just part of the process and not something to be embarrassed about. A surf shop stood across the street from the beach access, its windows filled with brightly colored boards and wetsuits. Richard walked over and stood outside looking at the display, feeling ridiculous and excited in equal measure. A young woman with sun-bleached hair and a deep tan was arranging board shorts on a rack near the window, and she looked up and waved at him, gesturing for him to come inside. The shop smelled like neoprene and wax and salt, a combination that was completely foreign to Richard and somehow appealing. The young woman approached him with an easy smile and asked if she could help him find anything. "I'm thinking about learning to surf," Richard heard himself say, and the words sounded absurd coming out of his mouth in his accountant's voice. "That's awesome," the woman said without a trace of mockery. "How much experience do you have?" "Well, none," Richard admitted. "I've never even been on a surfboard." "Everyone starts somewhere," she said, and began showing him beginner boards, explaining rocker and rails and volume in terms he barely understood. She recommended lessons with an instructor named Marco who specialized in adult beginners. And before Richard quite knew what was happening, he'd signed up for a 2-hour session that Saturday morning and put down a deposit on a rental board. He drove back to the office in a daze, made it through his afternoon appointments, and didn't mention anything to Susan when he got home that evening. He told himself he was waiting to see if he actually went through with it before saying anything, but the truth was he didn't want to hear the skepticism he was certain would be in her voice. Susan was practical and sensible, and those were qualities he'd always appreciated, but right now he didn't want practical or sensible. He wanted to do something completely unreasonable. Saturday morning arrived gray and cool, with a marine layer that the weather forecast promised would burn off by noon. Richard woke at 6 even though his lesson wasn't until 9, too nervous to sleep. Susan was still in bed when he left the house wearing board shorts he'd bought secretly during his lunch break on Thursday, and an old t-shirt from a company fun run 5 years ago. He'd told her he was going to the office to catch up on work, and she'd accepted this without question because he often worked Saturdays. The parking lot at the beach was nearly empty this early. Richard retrieved the rental board from the shop, struggling with its awkward length and weight, and carried it down to the sand where Marco was waiting with 3 other students. 2 were college-age kids who looked athletic and confident, and the third was a woman who appeared to be in her mid-40s, her anxiety visible in the way she clutched her board. Marco was perhaps 30, deeply tanned and relaxed in the way of people who spent their lives near the ocean. He greeted Richard warmly and began the lesson on the beach, demonstrating how to paddle, how to pop up into standing position, how to position your feet. Richard followed along, feeling self-conscious and clumsy, very aware of the softness of his middle-aged body compared to the younger students. Then they were in the water, and everything Richard thought he understood from the beach demonstration dissolved into chaos and cold and the shocking power of the ocean. The first thing that surprised Richard was how difficult it was simply to get past the breaking waves. Marco had made it look easy on the beach, explaining that you paddled hard and pushed through the white water, but the reality was entirely different. Richard lay on his board and paddled with what he thought was reasonable effort, only to have a wave lift him up and push him backward, depositing him nearly where he'd started. "Paddle harder," Marco called from beyond the break where he waited with the ease of someone completely at home in the water. "You've got to commit to it or the ocean wins every time." Richard tried again, his arms already burning from the unfamiliar motion. He dug deeper with each stroke and managed to push through the first wave, but the second one caught him by surprise and knocked him sideways off his board. The leash attached to his ankle kept the board from escaping, but also meant it came swinging back toward him as he surfaced, sputtering and disoriented. The board struck him in the shoulder hard enough to hurt, and he grabbed it reflexively, trying to climb back on while another wave approached. The college kids had made it out past the break already, sitting on their boards and looking completely comfortable. The woman around his age was having similar struggles, getting knocked down repeatedly, but climbing back on her board each time with a determination Richard found oddly encouraging. If she could keep trying, so could he. It took him nearly 15 minutes to make it out to where Marco waited, and by the time he got there, his arms felt like rubber and he was breathing hard. The cold water had soaked through his wetsuit in places and the morning air felt even colder against his wet skin. Marco gave him an approving nod. "Good persistence," he said. "A lot of people give up on the paddle out. Now we wait for the right waves." Sitting on the board beyond the break was its own challenge. Richard had to balance in a way that felt precarious. His legs dangling in water, he tried not to think about in terms of depth or what might be swimming beneath him. The ocean rose and fell in swells that looked gentle from the beach, but felt significant when you were sitting on top of them. Every few minutes a set would come through and Marco would evaluate each wave, sometimes telling one of the students to paddle for it and sometimes letting it pass. Richard watched the college boy go first. Marco pointed at an approaching wave and the kid turned his board toward shore and started paddling. Richard could see the wave lift him from behind, watched him pop up to his feet in one smooth motion, and then he was riding toward the beach, wobbling slightly but staying upright for a good 5 seconds before falling. It looked both easier and harder than Richard had imagined. "You're next," Marco said, pointing at Richard. "See that bump coming? When I say go, you paddle as hard as you've ever paddled in your life. Don't think, just paddle." Richard's heart was hammering as he turned his board to face the shore. He could see the wave building behind him, could feel the water starting to lift his board. Marco's voice cut through his nervousness. "Go, go, go." Richard paddled with everything he had, his arms screaming in protest. The wave caught him and suddenly he was moving fast, much faster than he'd expected, and his brain went blank trying to remember the sequence Marco had demonstrated on the beach. "Pop your chest up, bring your back foot forward, stand up." Except when he tried to execute the movement, his foot caught on something and he pitched forward, his face hitting the deck of the board before he tumbled sideways into the churning water. The wave rolled him like laundry in a washing machine. Richard had no sense of which way was up until his leash pulled taut and he followed it to the surface, gasping. His board had already washed most of the way to shore and he had to swim in to retrieve it, his legs shaky and his pride bruised worse than his body. Marco paddled over as Richard was climbing back on his board in the shallows. "That was good," the instructor said, and Richard looked at him to see if he was joking. "I didn't even get close to standing up," Richard said. You caught the wave and you committed to the pop-up, Marco replied. Those are the two hardest parts for beginners. The standing part comes with practice, you ready to go again. Richard's entire body wanted to say no. His arms were exhausted, his shoulder hurt where the board had hit him, and he was cold and waterlogged and hadn't managed to accomplish anything resembling actual surfing. But something stubborn in him refused to quit after just one attempt. He nodded and began the arduous paddle back out. The second wave went similarly to the first, except this time when he tried to stand his back foot slipped off the board entirely and he fell backward into the water. The third attempt he managed to get both feet onto the board for perhaps half a second before his weight shifted wrong and he toppled sideways. Each time he fell, each time he had to paddle back out through the breaking waves, each time his arms protested that they couldn't possibly do this anymore. The woman who'd been struggling alongside him caught a wave and actually stood up, riding it for maybe 3 seconds with her arms spread wide for balance, and a look of shocked joy on her face before she fell. When she paddled back out, she was grinning despite her obvious exhaustion. "Did you see that?" she called to Richard. "I was actually surfing for like 2 whole seconds." "Well, that was great," Richard said, and meant it, even though her success highlighted his own repeated failures. Marco took them through 6 more attempts each. The college kids were standing up regularly now, getting longer rides, even starting to turn their boards slightly. Richard fell every single time. His technique wasn't improving as far as he could tell. If anything, he seemed Richard's 9th attempt began like all the others. Marco spotted a wave with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent thousands of hours reading the ocean, pointed Richard toward shore, and gave the command to paddle. Richard's arms were so tired they felt disconnected from his body, operating on some reserve of stubbornness rather than actual strength. He paddled anyway, felt the wave lift him, felt that surge of speed as the water pushed him forward. This time when he popped up, something was different. His feet found the board, his weight settled over his center, and for 3 impossibly long seconds he was standing. Actually standing on a surfboard in the ocean with water rushing beneath him and the shore approaching and his arms spread wide like wings. His brain barely had time to register what was happening before his weight shifted too far forward and he nosedived into the water. But those 3 seconds burned themselves into his memory with startling clarity. When he surfaced, Marco was whooping and pumping his fist. The woman gave him a thumbs up, and even the college kids looked impressed. Richard climbed back onto his board feeling like he'd just accomplished something significant, even though rationally he understood that 3 seconds of beginner surfing was objectively nothing. "That's what I'm talking about," Marco said when Richard paddled back out. "You felt it, right? That moment when everything clicks." Richard nodded, unable to articulate what he'd felt. It wasn't just physical balance, but something else. Some brief alignment of intention and execution that had eluded him his entire adult life. In his work, everything was about careful planning and risk management and staying firmly in control. Surfing required letting go and trusting yourself to respond in the moment, and for 3 seconds he'd managed it. They went through a few more attempts, but Richard's arms were finished. He could barely paddle anymore, and his attempts to stand up became increasingly sloppy. Marco finally called an end to the lesson, and they all rode the white water back to shore on their stomachs, letting the broken waves push them in. On the beach, Marco went over what they'd learned and talked about practice and progression. He encouraged them all to come back, said that the first lesson was always the hardest, and it got easier from here. Richard only half listened, too exhausted to concentrate. His wetsuit felt like it weighed 50 pounds, and his arms hung uselessly at his sides. He returned the rental board to the shop and sat in his car for 10 minutes before he felt capable of driving. His hands were shaking slightly, whether from exertion or adrenaline or cold he couldn't say. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror and saw that his face was flushed and his hair was sticking up in strange directions from the salt water. He looked nothing like the careful accountant who'd left the house 3 hours earlier. The drive home took 30 minutes, and Richard spent it replaying those 3 seconds of standing on the board, analyzing the feeling the way he might analyze a particularly elegant solution to a complex tax problem. Except this wasn't something that could be solved with logic. It was physical and immediate, and required a kind of presence he'd spent decades training himself out of. Susan's car was gone when he pulled into the garage, which meant she was probably at the grocery store or running errands. Richard felt relieved to have a few minutes to shower and compose himself before seeing her. He peeled off his damp board shorts and stepped under hot water that felt almost painfully good against his cold skin. His shoulders and arms were already starting to stiffen, and he knew he'd be sore tomorrow in muscles he hadn't used in years, maybe ever. He dressed in his usual weekend clothes, khakis, and a polo shirt, and was making coffee when Susan returned with bags of groceries. She came in through the garage carrying 2 bags and set them on the counter, giving him a quick kiss on the cheek in the automatic way of long marriage. "How was the office?" she asked, beginning to unpack groceries. Richard opened his mouth to tell her the truth, that he'd been surfing, that he'd stood up on a board for 3 seconds, and it had felt like the most alive he'd been in years. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she was focused on organizing canned goods in the pantry. Or maybe it was his own uncertainty about what the morning had meant, whether it was a one-time experiment or the beginning of something larger. "Fine," he said instead, "got through most of what I needed to do." "Good," Susan said, not looking up. "Can you help me put these away? I've got book club at 2 and I still need to finish the last 3 chapters. They worked together in practiced silence, Richard putting away cereal and pasta while Susan dealt with produce and dairy. It was a routine they'd performed hundreds of times, efficient and wordless, and Richard felt the strangeness of it more acutely than usual. He'd just done something completely out of character, had pushed his body beyond what he'd thought it capable of, and here he was putting away groceries as if nothing had changed. After Susan left for book club, Richard sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and pulled out his phone. He found himself searching for surf shops, reading about board types and wetsuit thickness and tide charts. He discovered forums where middle-aged beginners shared their experiences and professional athletes posted technique videos. The deeper he went, the more he realized how little he understood, how much there was to learn. His phone rang and he saw it was his son calling from Boston. Richard answered and listened to Daniel talk about his engineering projects and a girl he'd started dating and the spring weather that was finally starting to arrive. Daniel asked about work and Richard gave his usual vague responses. Everything's fine, keeping busy, the usual. He didn't mention surfing and wasn't entirely sure why, except that it felt too new and fragile to speak about, like it might disappear if he examined it too closely. After the call ended, Richard sat looking out the kitchen window at the carefully maintained backyard. The lawn that a service mowed every week, and the flower beds Susan tended with methodical attention. Everything in his life was like this, he realized, carefully maintained and perfectly ordinary and utterly predictable. The surfing lesson had been a crack in that predictability, and he wasn't sure whether to seal it back up or let it widen. His body was definitely stiffening now. When he stood to refill his coffee, his shoulders protested, and his lower back ached in a way that made him feel every one of his 50 years. He probably should ice something, take some ibuprofen, maybe lie down for a while. Instead, he found himself back at his computer looking at Marco's website and the schedule of lessons offered throughout the week. Before he could second-guess himself, Richard clicked through and booked another lesson for the following Saturday, then added a second one for Wednesday evening after work. The confirmation emails arrived immediately, and he stared at them for a long moment, committed now to something he couldn't fully explain even to himself. Susan came home from book club full of opinions about the novel they'd discussed. Something about sisters and inheritance that Richard pretended to follow, while his mind kept returning to the ocean. They made dinner together, salmon and roasted vegetables, and ate while watching a home renovation show that Susan enjoyed. Richard's arms were so sore he had trouble lifting his fork, and Susan noticed. "Are you all right?" she asked. "You're moving like you hurt yourself." "Just slept wrong," Richard said, the lie coming easily. "Stiff neck." She nodded and returned her attention to the television, where a couple was debating whether to keep the original hardwood floors or install tile. Richard watched without seeing, his mind already on Wednesday evening and the next lesson, wondering if he'd be able to recapture those 3 seconds of standing or if they'd been a fluke, beginner's luck that wouldn't repeat. Later that night, as he was getting ready for bed, Richard caught sight of himself in the bathroom mirror and noticed something different. There was a faint pinkness across his nose and cheeks where the sun had gotten through the overcast morning, the beginning of what would probably be a mild sunburn. He touched his face gently, this small evidence of where he'd been and what he'd done, and felt a complicated mixture of satisfaction and guilt. He climbed into bed beside Susan, who was already reading her next book club selection, and when she asked if he wanted the light off, he said no, he might read for a while too. But instead of reading, he lay there thinking about waves and timing and the split-second decision to commit, to paddle hard and trust yourself to stand. It occurred to him that he'd been playing it safe for 30 years, building a life that was secure and predictable and profoundly unsatisfying, and maybe it was time to start taking different kinds of risks. His phone buzzed with a text message and he picked it up to find it was from Marco. "Great job today, Richard. You've got good determination. See you Wednesday." Richard typed back a quick thanks and set the phone on his nightstand. Beside him, Susan turned a page and adjusted her reading glasses, completely absorbed in her book, completely unaware that her husband had spent the morning learning to surf, and was planning to do it again as soon as possible. The distance between them felt enormous suddenly, an ocean he didn't know how to cross. He turned off his bedside lamp and closed his eyes, and his last thought before sleep was of that moment of standing on the board, balanced impossibly between water and sky, falling but not yet fallen, alive in a way he couldn't remember being before. Alive in a way he couldn't remember being before. Richard left work at 4:30 on Wednesday, earlier than he'd left on a weekday in perhaps 5 years. His assistant Jennifer looked surprised when he packed up his laptop and said he had an appointment, and his business partner David actually stopped by his office to ask if everything was all right. Richard assured him it was fine, just some personal business to take care of, and felt the weight of the small deception as he walked to his car. Traffic heading toward the coast was heavy with commuters leaving the city, and Richard sat in the slow crawl of cars feeling his anticipation mixed with nervousness. His body had been sore for 3 days after Saturday's lesson, muscles in his back and shoulders announcing themselves with every movement. He'd made excuses at the office, claiming he'd overdone it at the gym, which was laughable since everyone knew Richard didn't go to the gym. But no one had questioned it, and the soreness had finally started to ease yesterday. The beach parking lot was busier on a weekday evening than it had been Saturday morning, filled with people getting in a surf session after work. Richard changed into his board shorts in the public restroom, feeling self-conscious about his pale middle-aged body surrounded by younger men who moved with casual confidence. He pulled on the wetsuit he'd rented and grabbed the board, struggling again with its awkward bulk as he made his way down to the sand. Marco was waiting with 2 other students, both men who looked to be in their 30s, fit and athletic in a way that made Richard feel every one of his 50 years. They introduced themselves as Kyle and James, both software engineers who decided to take up surfing together. Their easy camaraderie made Richard feel even more isolated, the older outsider joining their recreational activity. "Good to see you back," Marco said to Richard warmly. "How's the body feeling?" "Getting better," Richard admitted. "I was pretty sore." "That's normal," Marco said. "Your body's learning new movement patterns. It gets easier." They started with the same beach drills, practicing the pop-up motion on the sand. Richard's movements were stiff compared to the younger men, his body less willing to fold itself into the required positions. He felt acutely aware of his limitations. The way his lower back resisted the twisting motion, and his knees didn't want to bend quite as deeply as they should. Then they were in the water and Richard remembered how much harder everything became once you added waves and cold, and the physical reality of the ocean. The paddle out was slightly easier this time, his body having some memory of what was required, but it still left him breathing hard by the time he made it beyond the break. The evening light was different from the gray morning of his first lesson, the sun lower in the sky and painting the water with golden undertones. The air was warmer and there were more surfers in the water, people who actually knew what they were doing, carving elegant lines across waves that looked much larger than the ones Marco was directing his students toward. Kyle went first and managed to stand up on his second attempt, riding the wave for maybe 5 seconds before losing his balance. James caught one shortly after and did even better, staying up for a longer ride that had Marco calling out encouragement. Then it was Richard's turn and the familiar anxiety clenched in his chest. "Don't overthink it," Marco called. "Your body knows what to do, trust it." Richard turned his board toward shore and waited for Marco's signal. When it came, he paddled hard, felt the wave lift him, and attempted the pop-up. His back foot caught again just like it had on Saturday and he fell forward, eating water and surfacing frustrated. He'd had 3 days to think about this, to visualize the movement, and still his body wouldn't cooperate. He paddled back out, his arms already protesting. Kyle and James took their turns, both successfully riding waves, their improvement visible even in this short session. Richard felt the comparison kindly, felt his age and his inexperience as fundamental disadvantages he couldn't overcome with determination alone. His second attempt was worse than the first, his timing completely off. He popped up too early and the wave passed beneath him, leaving him standing briefly on his board in flat water before he toppled sideways. The third attempt he popped up too late and the wave had already broken, just white water pushing him toward shore while he struggled uselessly on his board. Marco paddled over and sat beside Richard beyond the break, both of them rising and falling with the swells. "You're thinking too much," the instructor said. "I can see it in your face. You're trying to calculate the perfect moment instead of feeling it." "I don't know how to feel it," Richard said, hearing the frustration in his own voice. "I need to understand the mechanics." "Surfing isn't mechanical," Marco said. "It's responsive, the wave is always changing and you have to change with it. You can't plan it out like a project." Richard wanted to argue that everything could be broken down into learnable steps, that with enough analysis and practice any skill could be mastered. But the evidence was against him. He'd analyzed and practiced and he was still falling while younger men with less preparation were succeeding. They went through 4 more attempts and Richard managed to stand once briefly before his weight shifted wrong and he fell. It was progress, but it felt insufficient, not nearly enough improvement for the effort he was expending. By the time Marco called the lesson to an end, Richard was exhausted and discouraged in equal measure. In the parking lot, he peeled off his wetsuit and changed back into his work clothes, now wrinkled from being stuffed in his gym bag. His hair was wet and tangled with salt, and he tried to comb it into something presentable with his fingers. Kyle and James were nearby loading their boards onto a rack on Kyle's truck, talking and laughing about their rides, and Richard felt separate from their easy enjoyment. The drive home took 40 minutes in traffic, and Richard spent it trying to sort through his feelings. He'd expected surfing to be difficult, but he hadn't expected to feel so incompetent, so fundamentally unsuited to the activity. Maybe this was foolish, a middle-aged crisis that would end with nothing but sore muscles and wasted money to show for it. Susan was in the kitchen when he arrived home, pulling a casserole from the oven. She looked up when he walked in and her eyes narrowed slightly. "Your hair is wet," she observed. Richard's mind raced for an explanation. "Went to the gym," he said. "Took a shower there." "Since when do you go to the gym?" Susan asked, setting the casserole on the counter. "Thought I should start," Richard said, the lie expanding. "I'm not getting any younger, need to take better care of myself." Susan studied him for a moment, and Richard had the uncomfortable feeling she could see through him, but then she nodded. "That's probably a good idea. Dinner's ready in 10 minutes. Richard went upstairs to change, his heart beating faster than the small deception warranted. He looked at himself in the bedroom mirror and saw someone he barely recognized, hair stiff with salt water and face flushed from sun and exertion, telling lies to his wife about where he'd been. When had he become someone who lied, who hid pieces of his life? At dinner, Susan talked about her day, lunch with a friend, and a problem with the landscaping service, and plans for their daughter's upcoming visit during spring break. Richard made appropriate responses while his mind remained at the beach, replaying his failures and Marco's words about feeling instead of thinking. "Are you listening to me?" Susan asked, and Richard realized he'd missed something. "Sorry," he said, "long day, what were you saying?" "I asked if you wanted to go to the Hendersons' party Saturday night. It's their 30th anniversary." Saturday was his next lesson with Marco. Richard had already paid for it and had been looking forward to it despite this evening's frustrations. "I have to work Saturday," he said automatically. "Big deadline coming up." Susan's face showed disappointment and something else, maybe suspicion. "You've been working a lot of Saturdays lately," she said. "Busy season," Richard replied, which was true enough. Tax season was always demanding. "Maybe we can take them to dinner another time to celebrate." Susan nodded but didn't look happy about it. They finished dinner in silence and Richard helped clean up, then retreated to his home office claiming he needed to review some files. Instead, he sat at his desk and researched surfing technique on his computer, watching videos of proper pop-up form and reading articles about common beginner mistakes. His phone buzzed with a work email from David asking about a client file, and Richard responded quickly, handling the issue in 3 brief messages. Then another email came through from Jennifer with tomorrow's schedule, meetings stacked back-to-back from 9 until 4. His regular life asserting itself, reminding him of who he actually was. Thursday morning at the office, Richard moved carefully, his body sore again from the previous evening's session. He sat through a meeting about quarterly projections and another about potential new clients, contributing when needed but feeling strangely detached from it all. These meetings that had once seemed important now felt like time he could be spending in the water, learning something that actually challenged him. At lunch, his business partner, David, stopped by his office with sandwiches from the deli across the street. They ate while discussing a complicated estate case they were handling together, and David mentioned that Richard seemed distracted lately. "Everything okay?" David asked. "You're not having health problems or anything?" "No, nothing like that," Richard said. "Just tired, haven't been sleeping well." David nodded sympathetically. "Susan doing all right, kids?" "Everyone's fine," Richard assured him, and felt the weight of all the things he wasn't saying. That evening, Richard found himself searching for used surfboards online, looking at prices and specifications he didn't fully understand. He added items to a shopping cart on 3 different websites, but didn't complete any purchases, not ready to commit to that level of investment in something he still couldn't do competently. Friday passed in the usual blur of client calls and paperwork and small crises that needed managing. Richard handled it all efficiently while counting down the hours until Saturday morning, until his next chance to stand on a board and feel that brief moment of alignment between intention and action. He knew he was developing an obsession, and he knew it was probably unhealthy, and he didn't care. Saturday would be his 5th lesson, and he was determined that something would click, that his body would finally learn what his mind was trying to teach it. He fell asleep Friday night thinking about waves and timing, and dreamed of standing on a board that stretched away beneath him like a bridge to somewhere he couldn't quite see. Richard woke Saturday morning before his alarm, lying in the pre-dawn darkness and listening to Susan's steady breathing beside him. His body felt tight with anticipation, the same feeling he used to get before important presentations early in his career, back when work still had the power to make his pulse race. He slipped out of bed quietly and dressed in the clothes he'd laid out the night before, moving through the dark house like a thief. He left a note on the kitchen counter saying he'd gone to the office, the same lie he'd been telling for 3 weeks now, and felt a pang of guilt as he wrote it. The guilt wasn't strong enough to stop him, though. He grabbed his keys and headed out into the cool morning air, the sky just beginning to lighten at the edges. The drive to the beach felt different this time, charged with a determination that bordered on desperation. Richard had watched hours of instructional videos during the week, pausing and replaying sections about weight distribution and timing until he could recite the principles by heart. He understood the mechanics intellectually. His body just needed to catch up. The parking lot was emptier than it had been on Wednesday evening, just a few early surfers already in the water taking advantage of what looked like clean conditions. Richard could see the waves rolling in with glassy faces, the offshore wind holding them up in neat lines. He'd learned enough now to recognize good surf when he saw it, even if he couldn't yet take advantage of it. Marco was stretching on the beach when Richard arrived, along with 3 other students Richard hadn't seen before. 2 were women in their 20s who looked fit and capable, and the third was a man around Richard's age, but with the lean build of someone who'd been athletic his whole life. They introduced themselves and Richard caught the names but forgot them immediately, too focused on what lay ahead. The beach warm-up felt routine now, almost comfortable. Richard's body had learned the pop-up motion on sand, could execute it smoothly when there was no water or wave involved. It was the translation to the actual ocean that remained elusive. He watched the other students going through the drill and noticed small differences in their technique. The way the younger women compressed lower before springing up. The way the other man kept his chest high during the transition. Then they were paddling out and Richard's arms remembered the work, settled into a rhythm that got him beyond the break without the struggle of his first lessons. He sat on his board among the other students and felt the swells lift and lower them, watching the horizon for incoming sets. The morning light was golden now, the sun climbing above the eastern hills and painting everything with warm color. Marco pointed one of the women toward a wave and she caught it perfectly, popping up in one fluid motion and riding across the face with her arms stretched out for balance. She made it look easy, natural, like something humans were designed to do. The second woman went next and had similar success, her ride even longer, cutting back across the wave in a way that showed she'd been practicing between lessons. The other man caught his wave and stood up, but his weight was too far back and he couldn't generate speed, just standing in place as the wave passed under him until he had to step off into the water. Richard felt a small mean satisfaction at someone else's failure before feeling ashamed of the reaction. "Your turn," Marco said, and Richard turned his board toward shore. He waited for Marco's signal, forcing himself not to anticipate, not to plan every microsecond of what would happen. When Marco called out, he paddled hard, felt the wave lift him, and attempted the pop-up. His back foot landed on the board, but his weight was wrong and he toppled sideways, falling into the water with a familiar splash. When he surfaced, Marco was shaking his head. "You hesitated, I saw it. Right at the moment when you needed to commit, you held back." Richard paddled back out, frustrated. He hadn't felt himself hesitate, but Marco was right. There had been a fractional pause, some part of him pulling back from full commitment. It was the same instinct that made him a good accountant, the careful checking and double-checking before taking action, but in surfing that instinct was fatal. His second attempt ended the same way, and his third. The 2 women were taking multiple successful rides now, their confidence building visibly. The other man stood up on his 4th try and managed a respectable ride, whooping with excitement as he kicked out. Richard felt his frustration building into something darker, a real anger at his own inability. "Let's try something different," Marco said, paddling over to sit beside Richard. "Next wave, I want you to do everything wrong on purpose." Richard looked at him in confusion. "What do you mean wrong?" "I mean go too early, pop up too fast, don't think about your feet or your weight or anything you've learned. Just commit completely to whatever happens. Worst case, you fall like you've been falling anyway." It made no sense to Richard's orderly mind, but he was desperate enough to try anything. When Marco pointed him at the next wave, Richard turned and paddled without waiting for the usual careful timing. The wave lifted him and he threw himself into the pop-up with reckless abandon, not checking his foot position or worrying about his center of gravity, just moving. And suddenly he was standing. actually standing with the wave pushing him forward and the board alive under his feet. His arms were out for balance, and his knees were bent, and he was surfing, really surfing, not just standing for 3 seconds but riding for 5, 6, 7 seconds before the wave flattened out and he stepped off into knee-deep water. The feeling that flooded through him was pure elation, completely disproportionate to what he'd actually accomplished. He'd ridden a small wave for maybe 8 seconds. Objectively, it was nothing. But subjectively, it felt like he'd just climbed a mountain. Marco was grinning when Richard paddled back out. "There it is, that's what I've been waiting to see. You stopped thinking and just did it." Richard couldn't stop smiling. His face actually hurt from smiling. "Can I go again?" "Absolutely, remember that feeling. Don't go back to calculating." The next wave Richard caught and stood up again. This time for even longer, maybe 10 seconds of actual riding before he lost his balance. The wave after that he fell during the pop-up, but the one after that he stood up and managed to angle the board slightly. Not quite a real turn, but a shift in direction that felt like magic. By the end of the 2-hour lesson, Richard had successfully ridden 6 waves, and each one felt like a revelation. The 2 women had progressed to attempting turns, and the other man was stringing together longer rides, but Richard didn't care about comparisons anymore. He was focused entirely on his own experience, on the feeling of connection between his body and the board and the wave. In the parking lot afterward, Richard sat in his car for a long time, still feeling the residual adrenaline. His hands were shaking slightly, and he realized he was happier than he'd been in years, maybe decades. The realization was thrilling and deeply sad at the same time. What did it say about his life that learning to surf at 50 was the most joy he'd experienced since his children were born? He checked his phone and saw 3 missed calls from Susan. His stomach dropped. He called her back and she answered on the first ring. "Where are you?" she asked, and her voice had an edge he recognized as worry shading into anger. "I've been calling for an hours." "I'm sorry, I had my phone on silent," Richard said. "What's wrong?" "The Morrisons stopped by to drop off those documents you needed, and I told them you were at the office, and they said they'd just come from there and you weren't there." "So where are you, Richard?" He sat in his car with salt water drying on his skin and sand in his hair and felt the careful structure of his deception collapsing. He could lie again, could invent some meeting at a coffee shop or client visit, but something in him refused. Maybe it was the euphoria of finally standing up on the board, or maybe it was exhaustion with maintaining 2 separate versions of himself. "I'm at the beach," he said. "I've been taking surfing lessons." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Surfing lessons," Susan repeated, her tone flat. "For how long?" 5 weeks, Richard admitted. "Every Saturday morning and some Wednesday evenings." 5 weeks, Susan said. "You've been lying to me for 5 weeks about where you were going." "Yes," Richard said, because there was no point denying it. "Why?" Susan asked, and he heard genuine confusion under the anger. "Why would you lie about surfing lessons? Why wouldn't you just tell me?" Richard tried to find words for something he barely understood himself. "Because I knew how it would sound. 50-year-old accountant decides to learn to surf. I knew you'd think it was ridiculous." "I don't care if you want to learn to surf," Susan said. "I care that you've been lying to me every week. What else are you lying about?" "Nothing," Richard said quickly. "This is the only thing, I swear." "How am I supposed to believe that?" Susan asked. "You've been coming home and looking me in the eye and lying for weeks." Richard had no answer for that. She was right. He'd been lying and there was no justification that didn't sound pathetic. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "You're right, I should have told you." "Come home," Susan said. "We need to talk about this." She hung up before he could respond. Richard sat holding his phone and feeling the happiness of 20 minutes ago evaporating, replaced by dread and guilt. He'd known this moment was coming eventually, had known the lies couldn't be sustained indefinitely, but he'd pushed that knowledge aside in favor of the immediate pleasure of the water and the waves. He drove home slowly, trying to prepare for the conversation ahead. The house was quiet when he walked in and he found Susan in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. She looked at him and he saw her taking in his appearance, the board shorts visible under his jacket, his hair still damp and wild. "Sit down," she said, and her voice was carefully controlled in a way that scared him more than yelling would have. Richard sat across from her and waited. Susan took a sip of her coffee and set the cup down precisely in the center of its saucer. "I feel like I don't know you anymore," she said. "The man I married wouldn't have lied about something like this. He wouldn't have needed to." "I know," Richard said. "You're right." "So what changed?" Susan asked. "When did you become someone who keeps secrets?" Richard looked at his wife across the kitchen table where they'd shared thousands of meals over 2 decades of marriage, and tried to find the truth underneath all his rationalizations. "I don't know when exactly," he said slowly. "But somewhere along the way I stopped feeling like myself. Like I was just going through motions in a life that didn't quite fit anymore. And then I saw people surfing and it woke something up that I didn't know was asleep. Susan was quiet for a long moment. Why didn't you just tell me that? She asked finally. Why hide it? Because I was afraid, Richard admitted. Afraid you'd think I was having some kind of crisis. Afraid you'd talk me out of it. Afraid of how it would sound out loud. So instead you lied, Susan said. For 5 weeks you looked at me and lied. Yes, Richard said, and I'm sorry, truly sorry. Susan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the backyard. Her back was to him and Richard couldn't read her expression. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. I think you should sleep in the guest room tonight, she said. I need some time to think about this. Richard nodded even though she couldn't see him, then got up and went upstairs, leaving his wife alone in the kitchen with her thoughts and her coffee and the ruins of whatever trust they'd built over 22 years of marriage. The ruins of whatever trust they'd built over 22 years of marriage. Richard arrived at Mrs. Chen's studio 10 minutes early on Saturday morning, his guitar case feeling heavier than usual. Through the window, he could see her arranging sheet music on 2 stands, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She opened the door before he could knock. Right on time, she said, though he was early. Come in. The studio smelled of tea and old wood. Richard had been here dozens of times, but today everything felt different. The afternoon light slanting through the blinds, the metronome sitting silent on the piano, the framed concert posters from Mrs. Chen's performing days. Sit, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Play what you've been working on. Richard unpacked his guitar, his fingers already finding the familiar positions. He launched into the Tarraga piece he'd been drilling all week, the one he'd played perfectly in his bedroom, the one he'd butchered at the showcase. Halfway through the second phrase, Mrs. Chen held up her hand. Stop. Richard's hands froze over the strings. What are you thinking about right now? She asked, though the fingering for the next measure, there's a tricky stretch. Exactly. Mrs. Chen picked up her own guitar, a honey-colored classical instrument that had traveled with her from Taiwan 40 years ago. You're thinking about your fingers, not the music. Watch. She played the same phrase he'd just attempted. The notes were identical, but something fundamental had changed. The melody sang instead of spoke, each note breathing into the next. Do you hear the difference? She asked. You make it sound, I don't know, alive. Because I'm not playing notes, I'm playing the story the composer wrote. She set down her guitar and leaned forward. Richard, you have excellent technique. Your fingers do exactly what you tell them. But music isn't about obedience, it's about expression. I don't understand, I'm playing the right notes. You're playing correct notes, Mrs. Chen corrected. That's not the same thing. Tell me, why did you start playing guitar? The question caught him off guard. My dad had one in the attic. When I was 10, I found it and he trailed off, remembering. Saturday mornings in his bedroom, the guitar too big for his lap, his fingers aching as he fought through basic chords. No one had asked him to practice. No one had told him he should. He'd played because something in the sound made him feel less alone. I just wanted to, he finished quietly. And when did it become about being perfect? Richard stared at his guitar. He could pinpoint the exact moment. 7th grade, when he'd played at the school talent show and his classmate Marcus had whispered, he messed up in the middle. The comment had burned in his chest for days. After that, every practice session became a war against mistakes, every performance a test he might fail. I don't know, he lied. Mrs. Chen smiled like she could see straight through him. Let me tell you a story. When I was your age, I was studying at the conservatory in Taipei. I was not first chair, not even second. There was a girl, Mei Ling, who played like an angel, perfect intonation, perfect rhythm. I practiced twice as hard as her, but I could never catch up. She paused, her fingers absently tracing the grain of her guitar's top. One day, our teacher brought in a recording of a famous violinist, Jascha Heifetz. We listened to him play a Bach partita, and in the middle of the third movement there was a mistake. A tiny one, a slight scratch on a string change. Mei Ling looked triumphant. Even the great ones make mistakes, she whispered. But our teacher said something I never forgot. That mistake is proof he was taking a risk. He was reaching for something beautiful, not something safe. Richard felt something shift in his chest. What happened to Mei Ling? He asked. She became an excellent session musician, very reliable, very precise. Mrs. Chen met his eyes, but I don't think she ever loved playing, not really. They sat in silence for a moment, the afternoon sunlight creeping across the hardwood floor. I'm not saying technique doesn't matter, Mrs. Chen continued. It matters enormously. But technique is the vehicle, not the destination. Right now, you're so busy making sure the car runs perfectly that you've forgotten where you wanted to go. She picked up her guitar again. Let's try something different. I want you to play the Tarraga piece, but this time don't think about your fingers at all. Instead, imagine you're telling someone a secret, something important that you can only say through the guitar. Don't worry about mistakes, just speak. Richard positioned his hands, then hesitated. What if I mess up? Then you mess up. Mrs. Chen's voice was gentle but firm. I'm not grading you, the room isn't full of judges. It's just you, me, and the music. Play. He took a breath and began. For the first few measures, his fingers moved on autopilot, muscle memory carrying him through the familiar passages. But then something strange happened. In the third phrase, the part where the melody descended like falling leaves, he felt something. Not thought, but feeling. A kind of melancholy that lived in the minor key, a loneliness that the composer must have felt when he wrote these notes over a century ago. Richard leaned into it, letting the tempo breathe instead of marching forward. His right hand coaxed a softer tone from the strings, and the melody emerged like a voice from a crowd. He made mistakes. In the bridge, his finger slipped on a position change, producing a muted thunk instead of a clear note. But he didn't stop. He didn't restart. He let the music carry him forward, riding the current of the piece instead of trying to control every drop of water. When he played the final chord, letting it ring until it faded to silence, he looked up. Mrs. Chen was smiling, not the polite teacher smile she usually wore, but something genuine and warm. There, she said softly. There it is. I made mistakes, Richard said, but his voice lacked its usual self-reproach. You made music, Mrs. Chen corrected. For the first time in months, I heard you actually playing. Do you feel the difference? Richard did. His shoulders felt looser, his breath came easier. The anxious knot that usually lived in his stomach during lessons had loosened. It felt, I don't know, less like a test. Because it wasn't a test. It was a conversation between you and the composer, between you and the listener, between you and yourself. She set her guitar aside. Richard, you have a choice to make. You can keep chasing perfection, playing every note correctly and feeling miserable. Or you can chase expression, which means accepting that mistakes are part of the process. They're proof you're reaching for something real. But what about competitions, college applications? Those judges are counting mistakes. Some are, Mrs. Chen acknowledged. But the best ones, the ones who really understand music, they're listening for something deeper. They can hear the difference between someone who plays perfectly and someone who plays truthfully. And truthfully almost always wins. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where a couple walked by with a dog, ordinary Saturday afternoon life continuing. When I stopped performing, she said, her back still to him, it wasn't because of my technique. It was because I'd spent so many years being afraid of wrong notes, afraid of critics, afraid of not being good enough, that I'd forgotten how to enjoy playing. By the time I remembered, I'd already built a teaching career. She turned back to him, don't wait as long as I did. Richard carefully placed his guitar back in its case, his mind spinning. Everything felt different now, not solved, not fixed, but shifted. Like walking into a familiar room and finding the furniture rearranged, opening up space he didn't know existed. Can I ask you something? He said. That recording of Heifetz, the one with the mistake, do you still have it? Mrs. Chen's eyes crinkled. I do, would you like to borrow it? Yes. She pulled a CD from her bookshelf, an old recording, the case worn at the edges, and handed it to him. Listen to the whole thing. Pay attention not to whether he makes mistakes, but to what he's trying to say. As Richard packed up his guitar, Mrs. Chen added one more thing. Same time next week. But I want you to do something between now and then. Play every day, but not to practice. Play because you want to. Play the pieces you love, even if they're below your level. Play badly if that's how it comes out. Just play. That's it. No scales, no technique exercises. Oh, you should still do those, Mrs. Chen said with a slight smile. But do them after you've remembered why you're doing them in the first place. Richard left the studio with his guitar case in one hand and the CD in the other, stepping out into the afternoon sunshine. The world looked the same as it had an hour ago, same street, same cars, same distant sound of someone mowing their lawn. But something inside him had cracked open, letting in light. He thought about Maya at the showcase, her ukulele slightly out of tune, her voice wavering but filled with so much joy that the whole room had leaned forward to listen. He thought about the Taraga piece, how different it had felt when he stopped trying to conquer it and started trying to understand it. And for the first time in a long time, Richard actually wanted to go home and play. Not because he should, not because he needed to stay ahead, but because there was something he wanted to say, and music was the only language that could say it. The breakthrough wasn't that he'd suddenly become a better guitarist. It was that he'd remembered why he'd become a guitarist at all. Richard's room looked different when he got home. Not physically, the same clutter of music books still teetered on his desk. The same metronome sat like a silent judge on his nightstand. The same practice schedule was still taped to his wall, each day color-coded by technique focus. But somehow the space felt less like a training ground and more like just a room. He set down his guitar case and pulled out the CD Mrs. Chen had lent him. The cover showed a black-and-white photograph of Jascha Heifetz, violin tucked under his chin, his eyes closed in concentration. Richard slid the disc into his laptop and pressed play. The Bach partita filled his room, clean and precise at first, exactly what he expected from a master. But as he listened, really listened, he began to hear what Mrs. Chen had meant. Heifetz wasn't just executing notes. He was having a conversation, asking questions with the rising phrases, offering answers with the falling ones. And yes, there in the third movement, a tiny scrape as his bow changed strings, a sound that would have horrified Richard if he'd made it. But it didn't ruin anything. If anything, it made the music more human, proof that even legends reached beyond their grasp sometimes. Richard let the piece play while he unpacked his guitar. His practice schedule glared at him from the wall. Saturday scales, major, 3 octaves, arpeggio drills, sight reading, 30-min, repertoire review. He walked over and peeled it off the wall. For a moment, he just held it, looking at weeks of meticulous planning, color-coded optimization, every minute accounted for. It had made him good, he knew that. But it had also made him miserable. Richard folded the schedule and tucked it into his desk drawer, not throwing it away, not yet, but not letting it dictate his afternoon either. He sat on his bed, guitar across his lap, and realized something strange. He didn't know what to play when no one was telling him what to practice. The Heifetz recording moved into a gentler passage, the violin singing like a voice remembering something beautiful. Richard closed his eyes and let his fingers find the strings without thinking, without planning. The first thing that came out was a song his dad used to play, an old James Taylor tune, simple and warm. Richard hadn't touched it in years, had dismissed it as too basic once he'd started studying classical seriously. But now his fingers remembered it, stumbling at first, then finding the groove. He made mistakes, lots of them. His fingers landed between frets, producing buzzing sounds. He forgot the bridge entirely and had to loop back to the chorus. But something about it felt right, like greeting an old friend he'd been too busy to visit. When he finished, he found himself smiling. "Okay," he said aloud to his empty room, "what else?" He played a Beatles song he'd learned in middle school, before technique became serious business. Then a folk tune his first guitar teacher had shown him, the one that had made him fall in love with the instrument's voice. Then a piece he'd written himself 2 years ago, rough and unsophisticated, but honest in a way his polished repertoire never was. An hour passed without him checking the clock. At some point his mom knocked on the door. "Richard, are you okay?" "Yeah, why? You usually take a break by now. I brought you some apple slices." She pushed the door open, carrying a plate of fruit and looking vaguely concerned, like she'd expected to find him collapsed over his guitar. "I'm good," Richard said, accepting the plate, "just playing." His mom tilted her head, listening. "What's that piece? It's pretty." "Just something old, nothing important." "Well, it sounds nice." She lingered in the doorway. "You seem different today, good different." After she left, Richard sat for a moment, apple slice halfway to his mouth. When was the last time his mom had said his playing sounded nice? Usually she just reminded him not to practice too late, or asked if he needed her to time his sections, or praised his discipline in that careful way that felt more like observing a science experiment than enjoying music. He set down the plate and picked up his guitar again. This time he reached for the Tarraga piece, the one from the showcase, the one that had haunted him all week. But instead of diving into his usual methodical practice, isolate the difficult passages, slow them down, loop them 20 times, gradually increase tempo, he just played it. All the way through, and yes, he made mistakes. In the third phrase, his positioning was off and 2 notes came out muddy. In the bridge, he rushed the tempo because his fingers got excited. But he also found moments he'd never noticed before. A harmonic resonance in the 5th measure that made the guitar ring like a bell. A melancholy in the descending line that reminded him of autumn leaves falling. He played it again not to fix the mistakes, but because he wanted to hear it again. Then again, experimenting this time, taking the tempo a little slower in the opening, letting the notes breathe more. It changed the character entirely, made it more contemplative, like someone thinking aloud instead of making a statement. Somewhere in the 3rd or 4th run-through, Richard realized he'd stopped counting his mistakes. His phone buzzed. A text from Jake, "Dude, you coming to Mario Kart night? Everyone's here." Richard looked at his guitar, then at his phone. Usually he'd decline. Saturday nights were for practice, for getting ahead, for maintaining his edge. But today. "Can't tonight, rain check." Jake responded immediately, "You okay? You never miss Mario Kart. I'm good, just want to keep playing." "Who are you and what have you done with Richard?" Richard smiled and set his phone aside. He played until his fingertips ached, not the productive ache of disciplined practice, but the satisfying soreness of having said everything he needed to say. The sun set outside his window, painting his room in orange light, and the Heifetz recording looped back to the beginning. Eventually, he pulled out his phone and did something he never did. He recorded himself. Not for analysis, not to critique his technique, but just to capture the moment. He played a simple piece, the one his first teacher had shown him, the one that had made 10-year-old Richard think, yes, this is what I want to do forever. When he played it back, he heard mistakes, plenty of them. But he also heard something he hadn't heard in his playing for a long time, joy. That night, as Richard was getting ready for bed, his dad knocked on his door. "Hey, bud, just wanted to say I heard you playing earlier. Sounded great." "Oh, thanks," Richard paused, then added, "I'm sorry I've been so stressed lately." His dad leaned against the doorframe. "You know, when I gave you that guitar, I just thought you might like it. I never imagined you'd get this good. But somewhere along the way, I think we all forgot that it's supposed to be fun too. It's not that simple though, college applications, competitions." I know, his dad held up a hand. "I'm not saying those things don't matter. But they're not the whole picture. Your mom and we've been so focused on supporting your goals that maybe we forgot to ask if you're actually enjoying the journey." Richard sat on his bed, guitar resting against the wall. "I think I forgot too." "Well," his dad smiled, "sounds like you're remembering." After his dad left, Richard lay in bed staring at the ceiling. His practice schedule was still in the drawer, and part of him itched to pull it out, to return to the comfortable structure of measurable progress. But another part, the part that had spent the afternoon playing for no reason except that he wanted to, felt lighter than it had in months. He thought about Mrs. Chen's words, "Technique is the vehicle, not the destination." He thought about Maya at the showcase, her fearless vulnerability. He thought about the Heifetz recording, that tiny scratch of bow on string, proof of reaching. And he thought about the simple truth he'd rediscovered that afternoon. Music wasn't something to conquer, it was something to speak, something to share, something to love. Richard pulled out his phone and opened a voice memo. "Note to self," he said quietly into the darkness. "Tomorrow, play the Tarraga piece. Not to fix it, just to say what it needs to say, and if I mess up, I mess up." He paused, then added, "Also maybe text Maya, ask her where she learned to be so brave." He saved the memo and set his phone on the nightstand. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet except for the distant sound of a dog barking and a car driving past. Ordinary Saturday night sounds, the kind he usually tuned out when he was deep in practice mode. Tonight, he listened. And for the first time in a long time, Richard fell asleep not thinking about tomorrow's practice checklist, but about the music he wanted to make, not perfect music, not flawless music, but honest music that said something true. The breakthrough wasn't complete. Old habits didn't disappear in one afternoon. But a door had opened and light was streaming through, and Richard was finally ready to step toward it. Part 7 complete. This section shows Richard at home, putting his new mindset into practice. Instead of rigid, anxiety-driven practice, he rediscovers playing for joy, revisiting old favorites, experimenting freely, and learning to hear his own music without constantly counting mistakes. The transformation isn't instant or complete, but the journey toward healthier musicianship has genuinely begun.